Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Desi, and we are reviewing yet another episode of Frasier. This is episode 4 of season 1 called I Hate Frasier Crane. And this one starts with Frasier playing the piano. He is very annoyed that Eddie is just sitting there looking at him for no reason, and he starts like yelling at the dog and telling his dad like, "Hey, can you make this dog stop looking at me? This is really annoying." And Martin is just like doesn't really care and is indifferent because he's looking at an old case file from like 20 years ago. And then Niles shows up, brings a bottle of wine. How nice. And Niles was supposed to come with Maris, but of course Maris is absent. This is a recurring theme because she had another meltdown. And apparently it was like some one she's on the phone with before they left, and it was a very insignificant deal. Maris is very high strung. Frasier points this out, but Niles is just like, "Oh well, she's my wife. I have to deal with it." And Daphne comes in the room, and Niles starts hitting on her immediately and flirting with her, saying how wonderful she looks and everything else like that. And they sit down to have dinner. All four of them. I think this is the first time all four of them are together at the same table and like have an extended scene together. And Martin says prayer essentially because he's like, "Oh, don't you boys still say your prayer?" And so Martin just keeps going on and on with this prayer. And of course, Eddie walks over and starts staring at Frasier. And right in the middle of the prayer, Frasier yells at the dog, saying, "Oh my God, will you stop staring?" And while this prayer is going on, Niles has been eyeing Daphne, just like admiring her. And he thought Frasier was yelling at him. And Niles was like, "I wasn't staring," and gets super upset. And it's kind of funny because Niles is very embarrassed. And Frasier's like, "Oh, here we go again." Niles is completely out of his element with Daphne around. And Niles ends up handing Frasier the newspaper, and somebody has reviewed Frasier's show. A guy named Derek Mann, and he writes this column, and all the column says is "I hate Frasier Crane," which Martin thinks is hilarious. But that's all it says is "I hate Frasier Crane," and Frasier acts like he's not bothered by it, but then immediately starts complaining, saying like, "I'm a healer. How can this guy say that about me?" Pretending like he doesn't care, but he actually does, because that's how he is, because he's he's pretty sensitive about these things. And the next day, he's on his show, and he's talking to this lady who keeps putting him on hold. It happens 3 times, and the third time, Frasier basically goes off on her. He's still kind of tilted from this review, and he says that she's obsessed about what she thinks she's missing, and that's reason why one of the reasons why she's always going to the other line is because she thinks she's always missing something. And he goes on this like minute diatribe, like, "Hey, maybe this is your problem. This is why you can't be in like a long-term relationship," and diagnosing all these other problems, only to find out that he had her on, or she had him on hold yet again. And Frasier just hangs up on her because he's not having it anymore. And then comes one of my favorite scenes so far. Probably my favorite scene is where Frasier brings up the newspaper column, and he just goes off on this guy. And this is a show where he's supposed to be helping people, and he just spends like 5 minutes literally just saying like that this guy is lazy, intellectually lazy, didn't write anything constructive. Like, how can you just write "I hate Frasier Crane"? And sarcastically says this low effort post will land the column among the pantheon of immortals. He said that exactly, pantheon of immortals, with Voltaire and H.L. Mencken. And he just goes off on him, and it's actually pretty juicy for 1993 and this being a sitcom. It's very spicy, and I loved every minute of it. And at the end here, you see where his mic position is. He literally blows on the mic and does a twirl and holsters it, and then just gives Roz this smirk. And it's so good. It's one of my favorite moments on the show thus far. I watched the show back in the day, but it's so good. He is just being so petty, and I'm loving this. So they all meet for lunch, and this is the first time we see Roz and Niles on the screen. And Niles ends up bringing Frasier the paper again, where Derek Mann, the columnist, has responded directly to Frasier lambasting him. And this is like free publicity. Like, I don't know why it's not mentioned in it. This is like free publicity for Frasier's show. So, but Niles and Roz right here. This is such a good duo because Roz is so different from Niles, almost completely opposite people, but yet they have this really fun chemistry that I love. And Niles is just completely giddy over Frasier getting so wound up and tilted over this war of words. And the columnist basically says, okay, Frasier, since you don't want to be intellectually lazy, I'm going to go piece by piece saying why your show is dog crap, essentially. And it's really spicy what he says. And the columnist calls his style poor, his tone pompous, and his sympathies fake, and just says that he's full of crap and like a pseudo-psychologist. And Roz ends up calming Frasier down, saying it's going to blow over, and Frasier agrees to be mature about this and not bring it up. Well, the very next day, he brings it up, and he literally spends the entire radio show just lambasting this columnist yet again, insults his use of grammar and the substances of an argument, just saying that he's pathetic. And this is so funny because this is like the 1993 version of a keyboard forum war. This is the precursor to that. These two it's so spicy and I love it. This is, you just don't see this a lot in like a sitcom of and Frasier is just being so petty. And it's just such a perfect reflection of the flaws of his character. Like, he is so salty when anybody says anything bad about him, and he can't handle any sort of criticism, and he's just acting so childish, even though he's trying to help people. And there's like people on the line wanting to get help and having issues. One of them has a delayed gratification problem, and Frasier just like unironically says, like, I don't want to talk to him, I'm not done yet, he's just going to have to wait. And the guy ends up hanging up. And Frasier just says that this guy is a coward and he's acting like a school child, a schoolyard bully or whatever, just acting and writing behind, not saying this to Frasier's face, essentially, and calls him a coward, more or less. And unironically, I love this expression too. The next caller is Derek Mann himself. And one of my favorite lines, he says, I'm not going to have my manhood challenged by an Ivy League twit. And essentially throws down the gauntlet saying, all right, let's have a fisticuff. Let's get engaged in a fight. And Frasier's initially like, oh, wait, you actually want to get in a fist fight? Because Frasier is not the most... he's not the most physical sort of person. So Frasier's like, and because he's in the heat of the moment, and because all of his listeners are calling him chicken, and even this Derek Mann guy clucks at him like he's a chicken, he accepts the fight. And it's so funny because right afterwards, after he accepts the fight, he goes and he says, who else wants a piece of me? He's acting like really macho, and it's so funny because that's not Frasier at all. He's just so wound up and so tilted, and he's acting like such a keyboard warrior and being so childish. It's so juicy and it's so good. So he goes back home, and Martin's still working on his case. Daphne has another psychic episode and correctly guesses what the name of the person who died was and the fact that she had 3 brothers. And while this is happening, Frasier walks in. Martin says, oh, well, I'm really glad that you're sticking up for yourself here. And Frasier's like, well, I'm not actually going to fight this guy. And Martin just is really mad about this. And he's just, you can't just turn tail and run. And he actually brings up an old bully that Frasier ran away from and how it embarrassed Martin. And like he had to hear it from the precinct because this guy's dad was a cop too. And Martin basically got a bunch of flack for years and years because Frasier turned tail and ran from this fight. And he's really egging on Frasier. And I don't know how I feel about this because this is Martin being really toxic and like deliberately trying to get his son to get into a physical altercation rather than try to fix it, rather than try to apologize and reconcile. He's just being like, "Oh, well, you accepted this guy's fight. You have to do this." And they keep arguing. And Martin tells Frasier that he'd be embarrassed if his son didn't accept the fight. And Martin says he can't even look at his son and walks away because he's so disgusted by it. And this is really, I don't like this part of the episode at all. Like, I liked all the spiciness with the words and everything else like this, but Martin, like, Frasier doesn't want to get in this fight. He's not a fighter. But Martin is just like, you know what? You'll embarrass me if you don't do this. And it's really toxic masculinity is its peak. Here I go bringing up that again, but this is 1993. It's a recurring theme, even though Frasier doesn't show a whole lot of it outside of his like war of words with this guy. But anyway, next day it's the day of the fight, and of course Frasier's overdressed for a fight because he is overdressed for everything. And Roz tells him this lewd story about this guy who saw her naked or something like that. And Frasier's like, "Why are you telling me this?" And Roz is like, "Listen, you're about ready to get your ass whooped. So I'm going to tell you this random story to get your mind off of it." And Frasier's like, "Well, what do you think? Did you ever consider that I might win?" And Roz is like, "No, no, no way." And there's this really cool scene where Martin actually comes up to Frasier as Frasier's getting ready to fight. And Martin says, "Hey, I said some really nasty stuff to you. You don't have to go through with this." And Frasier looks at his dad and says, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. Don't worry about it." And they end up seeing this guy, Derek Mann, and he ends up being like this 6'6", muscular, built like a brick house sort of guy. And Frasier's just like, "Well, I'm not ready to go get my butt kicked." So he's very nervous, but he ends up going out and going through with it, which makes Martin extremely proud. And they're actually getting ready. None of this is on screen, by the way. It's outside of the coffee shop. And right before they're getting in, they get into the circle with each other and like start circling. And right before they come to blows, the cops show up and break it up. And they bring him back in, and Frasier's like, "Oh my gosh, I actually went through this. I'm so happy with myself." And he avoided getting his butt kicked because the police broke it up. And it turns out, since Martin was an ex-cop, that he arranged to have the police come right before this fight occurred. And he ends up being really proud of his son. Frasier gains a lot of confidence for actually going through with something. But yeah, Martin knows that Frasier would have gotten beaten up really bad. And that's more or less the end of the episode. The final end credits are just Eddie looking at a picture of Frasier, which I thought was kind of dumb, so I didn't include it. But so far, I think this is my favorite part of the show yet, my favorite episode yet, because it is so spicy. Like, Frasier is being so petty, and it's really juicy, and I love it because it's funny. And it honestly, it's the way I used to act in my like younger 20s when I was playing video games and just talking crap to other people. And it's the keyboard warrior meme is in here very prevalent of like somebody who just talks a bunch of crap. In Frasier's case, behind a booth, where as most people would do it on the internet, but that obviously the internet wasn't even around at this time. So, anyways, very spicy episode. I really liked it, and thank you all for watching. And I'm enjoying these. This one, the last one was kind of dull. A lot of people liked it, but I didn't really. But this one, I really enjoyed. I enjoyed this one a lot. It's my favorite so far. Anyways, thank you for watching. Peace.